As we move closer to the first UFC event of 2025, I wanted to talk about some of the top prospects heading into this year in the UFC. So we're going to be going through my top 13 prospects. I had a few criteria here. The first one is going to be that they've actually had to fight in the UFC. So guys that maybe won on the Contender Series but haven't actually debuted, they are not going to be included here. To be considered a prospect, I'm going to be talking about fighters that have never been ranked. So these guys have not appeared in the top 15. And then age-wise, I'm going to be looking at guys that are 30 or younger. Maybe you could make the case for some of the heavier weight classes that you can have prospects in like their early to mid 30s. But honestly, even at like light heavyweight, I don't think there are a ton of options out there that are above that 30-year-old threshold. So those are, I guess, like the three pieces of criteria. These are going to be loosely ranked on how, good of prospects I think they are, but it is kind of tough because are we basing it just on like pound for pound, or are we basing it on how likely they are to actually get to the title? Because you could have someone in a weaker weight class with better odds, but maybe they don't seem like some sort of elite prospect. So loosely, trying to rank them based on how good I think they are. So we're going to start off here with Bo Nickel. And it's kind of crazy because it seems like he's like past this prospect stage, or it seems like people want to like just throw him to the wolves at this point. But he is still very much a prospect in MMA, 28 years old, fighting at middleweight. He's just had expectations that are so unbelievably high. For someone who was only 7-0 as a pro and 4-0 in the UFC, he is still very, very green in his MMA career. And, you look at the wins, he's not fighting, these amazing guys, finishes over Jamie Pickett, Val Woodburn, Cody Brundage. All three of those dudes, pretty much not UFC level or like right on the verge of not being in the UFC. And then his most recent fight, a decision win over Paul Craig. Obviously, if you know Bo Nickel, everyone's hyped about his wrestling, a 3-time NCAA wrestling champion. And he only made his amateur MMA debut in 2021. So I think he's in this spot where he had the name coming over from wrestling. He does a fairly good job of promoting himself. I think he, is fairly active on YouTube. He's posting a lot. He's getting a lot of interviews because of his popularity. And people see that. They see him talking about being a champion, fighting Hamzat, and they just want to see him running through everyone. They want to see him, knocking out or submitting Paul Craig in the first minute. They want to see him getting pushed up the rankings. But I think he's kind of taking the smart approach here by getting some fights under him. There's no reason to push it. He's 28 years old. Clearly, he's making money outside of his fighting. So I think it's smart for him to kind of, slowly move up towards that, top 15. I think the big question here for Bo is just what is his striking ceiling going to be? Because you see him trying to use it in his fights. He had a knockout on the feet against Val Woodburn. He has a solid overhand when, he's feinting it with the takedown. So he does do some things well. He struck for 3 rounds with Paul Craig. But I guess what he's going to have to figure out is he ever going to get good enough as a striker to be able to hang on the feet with top middleweights? Not saying he's going to go out there and have a, striking battle with Israel Adesanya or a Dricus du Plessis or Sean Strickland, but is he going to be good enough where he can shoot a takedown, strike for a couple minutes, then get back to the wrestling? Or is he going to have to be like a Khabib level wrestler where, Khabib could potentially hold his own on the feet, but it was just because of the threat of the takedown. So is he just going to be someone who's going to be takedown or bust where he needs to get the guy to the ground or he's kind of screwed? I feel like it's still up in the air at this point, but with that wrestling up at middleweight, you don't have a ton of top wrestlers up there. I still think he is a great prospect. Maybe one fight away from getting a shot at the rankings, but I do think he has a decent shot to be champion. And I do think in a few years, him versus Hamzat will be a massive fight if he can't get there. Now, my next prospect is going to be Jean Silva, 28 years old, fighting at featherweight out of the very popular and rising Fighting Nerds gym. He is 3-0 in the UFC. He has had a round 1 knockout over Weston Wilson. He had a round 2 knockout over Charles Jourdain, who was actually his first knockout loss, a nasty uppercut, pretty much put him out cold. And then he had a round 3 doctor stoppage win against Drew Dober. And obviously beating Drew Dober, by itself is impressive, but it was a short notice fight up a weight class at 155, and he went in and pretty much outdogged Drew Dober, damaged him a ton, ended up getting that finish in the 3rd round due to a cut. He has 13 finishes in his 14 wins, and he's currently booked against Melsik Bagdasaryan on February 22nd. Honestly, kind of a step down in competition. I definitely could have seen him getting a shot at the rankings, but I don't think him kind of getting slow played a little bit is the worst thing. Probably going to have another nice performance. Think he beats Melsick. He should have a shot at the top 15. And with his power, the fact that he was able to go up and beat a guy like Drew Dober, I think he's going to be a contender here moving forward in the featherweight weight class. The next prospect, one weight class down at bantamweight, it is going to be Peyton Talbot, 26 years old. Obviously, Peyton Talbot has a ton of hype behind him. He has a 9-0 record. He is 3-0 in the UFC, 2 knockouts, 1 submission. He has finishes in 8 of his 9 fights. The only time he went to decision was on the Contender Series, and that was against a super durable opponent. I think it was actually Tracy Cortez's brother, who just took a ton of damage, but was able to stay in that fight. He put on an absolute masterclass against the very, very talented Cameron Simon. People thought Simon was going to be this great prospect. Still might be a very good prospect, but Talbot went in there, just completely annihilated him. He is super clean striking, forward pressure, has real power for the 135-pound weight class, and he is booked to fight at UFC 311 against Raoni Barcelos. I think he's like a minus 1,100 favorite, something crazy, against a guy like Barcelos, who's like a legit dude outside the top 15 at bantamweight. So the Vegas, betting odds think he's the real deal. He's proven it so far. I think he's a super interesting guy, super interesting prospect, and I would expect him to probably get a shot at the top 15 if he does get through Barcelos. Maybe one more fight. An Adrian Yanez matchup would be fun, but Peyton Talbot definitely on the rise towards those rankings. Now for the next guy, we're going to be moving way up in weight. We're going to go all the way up to light heavyweight, where we have Umar Sy, who is 29 years old, and he is like the rare heavier weight class prospect. Typically, you're not getting a lot of these elite prospects coming in at 205 heavyweight, but I do think Sy is that guy. He is 11-0. He is 6'4" with an 83-inch reach. So a physical freak. He has 4 wins by knockout, 4 wins by sub, and 3 by decision. And he's also interesting because he is primarily a wrestler, which is a bad matchup for a lot of dudes up at 205. I also just think in terms of his ceiling, he has a lot of room to grow with his frame and just raw athleticism. He's 2-0 in the UFC. Honestly, probably one more win and he's knocking on the door of the top 15. This is not some sort of stacked weight class. So with his athleticism, his physicality, his style, I do think he's going to be a player in this weight class, and I would not be shocked if he ends up fighting for the title or maybe even becoming champ at some point in the UFC. Now we're going to be going back down to bantamweight, where we have Felipe Lima, 26 years old, actually just fought recently on the Tampa card. He is 14-1 and is actually on a 14-fight win streak. So his only loss was his MMA debut. Since then, he has won 14 straight. He debuted in the UFC on short notice, up a weight class against a very tough Muhammad Naimov, finished him in the 3rd round with a submission. He just won a clear decision over the very tough Miles Johns, who was 6-2 in the UFC heading into that matchup. He's super well-rounded, 4 knockouts, 3 submissions, 7 decision wins, and he's gone 5 rounds on the regional scene. So he had solid competition before he got into the UFC, an impressive win up a weight class, then an impressive win, clear win over someone who found a lot of success in the very tough bantamweight division. I think Felipe Lima is the real deal. Maybe doesn't have the same push as a guy like Peyton Talbot, but I think his ceiling is very high. I think he's going to be ranked at some point in this weight class and could make a push towards that title. Up next, we have probably one of the more popular guys in this video. We have Mauricio Rufy, 28 years old, another one of those fighters from the Fighting Nerds. He is 11-1, 2-0 in the UFC. Once he made his debut, the comparisons to Conor McGregor were all over the place, how fluid he is on the feet, his creative striking. There are a lot of similarities there. In his 11 wins, he has 10 knockouts, so finished 10 of 11 wins, 1 decision. He faced a little bit of adversity in his last fight. It was still a clear win, but James Lontop was super durable, so he took a lot of those big shots, was able to survive. Maybe we saw the gas tank start to be a question mark for Rufy. And I think, honestly, it's kind of the same question you have with Conor, where when he's fighting, throwing all the kicks, all the spinning attacks, it's not a style that's super conducive for a 5-round fight, even like a high-paced 3-rounder. So can that style hold up? Is he going to have to gear back some of those spinning attacks, those big movements? It's something we'll have to, kind of wait and see, but he looks super fun. I definitely think he's going to be someone who's pushing towards getting into the rankings, probably here in 2025. Super fun to watch, coming out of that gym with a ton of studs. Mauricio Rufy, definitely a very interesting prospect here at welterweight. For this next prospect, we are going to be moving up to middleweight, where we have the 30-year-old Shara Bullet Magomedov. He is 15-0 overall, 4-0 in the UFC, and in those 4 UFC fights, he has 2 performance bonuses and then 1 fight of the night. So he's having fun, spectacular performances. He's a high volume striker, very creative, probably most known for his kicks, lead leg kicks, just throwing all sorts of stuff at his opponents. I do think he's been a little bit protected style-wise. I think a lot of people see the name. They've seen his fun fights, like the double spinning back fist knockout he had in 2024. Like, that was probably a top 3 knockout of the year. So I think they see that, and they think he should be higher in this video. But I do think you look at his matchups. He has fought 3 strikers. He's obviously a striker, and 1 grappler. And the 1 grappler he fought was Tricoli, who I just don't think is UFC level. I think he lost his next fight very quickly to Trayshawn Gore. And now he is fighting Michael Venom Page, who is moving up from welterweight. They're fighting on February 1st. So another striker and a striker moving up from a lower weight class. I think the wrestling defense is still a big question mark here. In his UFC debut, he was taken down 3 times by Bruno Silva. Bruno Silva is like a pure striker. And then same thing with Mikhail Olszewczuk. He was taken down 3 times by him. Another dude who is primarily a striker. So it'll be interesting when we see him get matched up against someone who does have good wrestling, good grappling. How is he going to hold up? I think a lot of people, see the Magomedov last name. They assume, oh, he's going to have amazing wrestling. That's not really what we've seen so far. The dude is a legit striker, 100%, but the wrestling still up in the air. So I think he's a fun prospect. He's super fun to watch. And honestly, from the UFC's perspective, they should continue giving him striker versus striker matchups because that's what the fans want to see. But in terms of his ultimate ceiling, I do think that, is something that's going to be tested here. Now we're going to go down to lightweight with Mitbek Oralbai. I know I butchered the first name. Oralbai, the dude, looks like he was born 9,000 years ago. 26-year-old lightweight. 13-2-1 as a pro, 2-1 in the UFC, and 2-1, it's a fine record, but he has faced a very high level of competition for someone in their first 3 fights. He has wins over Elvis Brenner and Uros Medic. Medic as a debut is a really solid win. Then Elvis Brenner, turned back a guy like Guram Kutaladze, a legit kind of dude who's just been fed prospects at this point. And his only loss was a split decision loss in potential fight of the year contender against Mateusz Rambeski. It's a super back and forth fight, super violent. He's very well rounded, 6 knockouts, 5 submissions. I guess my only concern here is he's already had 2 wars in the UFC. And if you're a young prospect, ideally you're winning these fights. And even if you're losing, you're not taking a lot of damage. He is taking a lot of damage, and it's not really a massive shot at him, right? He's facing tough dudes. You're not going to fight Elvis Brenner and Mateusz Rambeski and be completely unharmed. But just in terms of his long-term durability, it's not ideal. Still think he's a super fun prospect. It's a really tough weight class here at lightweight, but definitely someone who I think is going to make a push to get ranked potentially here, in 2025. Now for these next 2 prospects, we are going to be going all the way down to flyweight, where I think we have some interesting kind of young blood here in that weight class, and a division that kind of needs it with the title picture being up in the air just because of Pantoja's dominance. I will give an honorable mention to Joshua Van. He's someone I actually wrote up a thing for, had notes, but he is currently ranked number 15, so does not qualify because he is ranked. So the 2 we have, the first one is going to be Ray Saruya, a 22-year-old flyweight, so very, very young. He is 10-0 as a pro. He was on the road to the UFC, so he had 3 wins on that variant of the UFC, I guess. And then he has 1 official UFC win. He's a super impressive grappler, has solid submission game, and also really dominant ground and pound. I want to say it was his final road to the UFC fight. He had this dude in just all these brutal positions, ended up getting the finish with I think a second or 2 left in the first round. He has 4 knockouts, 4 submissions. So even though he is primarily a wrestler, he's still finding finishes, with the ground and pound and the submissions. He is booked to fight Stuart Nicole in February. Interesting fight, but I would expect him to win that one. And I think he can, start to build some momentum here. We saw another guy, Tetsuro Taira, someone who is very grappling heavy, make it pretty far up before he suffered his first loss in the UFC. I think Ray Saruya could definitely be on a climb to get ranked as soon as 2025. And then the other guy here is Loner Kavanaugh, a 25-year-old flyweight, also undefeated, 8-0, 1-0 in the UFC. He is an explosive striker, carries a lot of power for flyweight. You're not really seeing dudes putting guys out cold at flyweight. He has that power, had a nasty left hook, 1-punch KO on the Contender Series. The interesting thing about him is, even though flyweight is the lowest weight class for men in the UFC, he's probably undersized for the weight class. He's only 5'4" with a 67-inch reach. Definitely, fairly muscular, but 5'4", even for flyweight, is pretty small. I still think he's fun as a striker. Like I said, 1-0 in the UFC, won that one by decision. Will be interesting to see how he fares in his upcoming fights. Couple of guys left here. We have Brian Battle up at welterweight, 30 years old. He won the Ultimate Fighter. He is 7-1 in the UFC. Really impressive record. His only loss was to Rinat Fakhretdinov, where he was pretty much just like controlled wrestled for 15 minutes. He has 5 finishes in those 7 wins. His last fight, pretty close, somewhat controversial split decision win over Randy Brown. I think the reason it was most controversial was just the fact that he missed weight. So you miss weight, you have a clinch-heavy attack, it's a close fight, you're not going to get the benefit of the doubt in the eyes of the fans, but he is very well-rounded, 4 knockouts, 5 submissions, 3 decisions, someone who can push a pace up at 170. Maybe like his title aspirations, like at 30 years old, I don't know if he's someone who's going to make a run at the title, but definitely someone who I think could stick around in like the 5 to 15 area in the welterweight division for, at least a little while here. And then the final prospect here, we have Esteban Ribovics, 28 years old at lightweight. He is 14-0. His only loss was his UFC debut. He had a great 2024. He was in the fight that I would have as the fight of the year against Daniel Zellhuber. That was at the UFC Sphere card. Like, in my opinion, that's the most memorable moment from that card. Just an amazing fight. And then his other fight in 2024 was a 37-second head kick KO against Terrence McKinney. So he had a great year, both just in terms of like quality wins and just super fun performances, like a fight of the year and knockout of the year contender in 2 fights. Pretty awesome. He's a dangerous, durable striker, but kind of interestingly, he started his career as like a submission threat. 5 of his first 6 wins were actually by submission, which was somewhat surprising because you look at him in the UFC, he's, pretty much just going out there to stand and bang. Obviously, lightweight is a super tough weight class. Even getting into like the top 15 is a pretty insane accomplishment. So it'll be interesting to see how far he can go. Like, is he going to be able to break into that top 15? We'll see, but I wanted to give him his respect. A couple of really solid wins this year, and the fact that he's in such a tough weight class, I don't think should remove him from being in this video. So that is going to wrap it up. I believe that was my top 12 prospects heading into 2025. So look out for these guys. Hopefully they continue to make their push, within their weight classes. But let me know your thoughts. If you had a prospect that was left off, would love to hear them. Drop the name down below. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.